Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ISAS, and we have with us today Dr. Rani Mullen, who's ISAS Visiting Research Fellow. Dr. Mullen studies Afghanistan, and since the country just celebrated its Independence Day on Sunday, we thought we'll sit down with her and have a chat about Afghanistan and the prospects for peace in the country. As you may know, there has been a lot of talks between Taliban and the Afghan government about peace, as well as the role of the US in the country. So we thought we'll have a chat with Dr. Mullen to find out her take and her perspectives on all of these issues. Welcome, Dr. Mullen. As I mentioned earlier, the Afghan government announced recently as well that there will be a ceasefire with the Taliban over the Eid period this week. Now, this follows a similar truce during the previous Eid period in June. So how do you read such calls for truce, and do you expect them to have a longer-term effect on peace in the country?
Thank you. First, I wanted to wish everyone Eid Mubarak. And then I wanted to say that, you know, it's sad that on a day when Afghans are trying to celebrate Eid, and as President Rani was giving his Eid message, rockets rained down and came down near the presidential palace. So I think that shows the tenuous nature of security and life in general in Afghanistan. The Eid ceasefire that was announced on Afghanistan's 99th Independence Day on Sunday was, as you mentioned, the second Eid ceasefire. That it was, unlike the first one, a conditional ceasefire because, as the government said, they are only willing to engage in a ceasefire if the Taliban also adheres to it. So first of all, it was similar to the previous Eid, but it was a ceasefire, but it was a different one in terms of that it was conditional. Now, the question of longer-term effect, I think just to go back to the first Eid ceasefire and what that meant. This one, like the first one, was obviously welcomed by Afghans, you know, at home and abroad. And I think that's the, one of the important things to realize, that Afghans are just fed up with war, and that the overwhelming majority of Afghans want peace. The recent proposal for a ceasefire or conditional ceasefire was made by Ghani. The Taliban to date have not responded, and today, of course, is Eid. The previous Eid truce came about through several conditions, and I think if we look at those, we get an understanding of how something has changed in the story and in the momentum and why it came to this second proposed Eid truce. The first one was, I think, a changing momentum in the legitimacy of this so-called jihad that the Taliban said they're waging. And the change in legitimacy has come about because there were a series meetings of Islamic scholars and religious leaders who met initially in May in Indonesia. These were Afghan and Indonesian religious scholars who came together and condemned suicide attacks in particular, but violence, and came out saying that this was not in line with the teaching of the Quran. Then there was a meeting in Kabul of 2,000 ulema scholars who in turn had quietly met with other religious scholars and imams, etc., in the villages and districts of Afghanistan, and they came together, a meeting of 2,000 ulema scholars in Kabul, and issued a statement saying again that this was not in line with Islamic teachings, that suicide was in fact forbidden, and that it was time for the Taliban and the Afghan government to come to the negotiating table. So that changed the legitimacy that the Taliban had in terms of actually, using this sort of this cover that it was in fact a jihad, which had been debunked now by their own scholars and religious leaders, saying that that was not the case. It also came about because international actors in the region and outside were increasingly putting pressure on the Taliban. I think many people have talked about the U.S. government, pushing also and talking to the Pakistanis to put pressure on the Taliban in the Quetta areas. So, but not only the U.S. and Pakistan, also the Chinese, who are increasingly, worried not only about possibilities of what would happen if terrorists would come into their western region of Xinjiang, but also they have plans for this $60 billion CPEC, the Chinese-Pakistani Economic Corridor, which will stretch from Gwadar port on the coast of Pakistan all the way up to Xinjiang province in China. And so worries about what happens to their economic investments and their projects, roads, the port, in fact, if these are all under attack by terrorists and non-state actors in the region. So China increasingly involved, and that might be a game changer also because of China's influence in Pakistan. And then what really hasn't gotten much attention is the role that Indonesia has played as a broker, as a site for bringing together these scholars. So you had international actors also who were increasingly putting pressure on the Taliban to come to the negotiating table. So that was sort of factor number two. But then what has really been new, what has really changed, I think, is that Afghans themselves have started mobilizing. And we saw this in Helmand province earlier this year. Helmand, you might know, is one of the most insecure provinces in Afghanistan, where produces much of the opium poppy crop. And in this most insecure province, there was an attack earlier this year at a wrestling match, and in response to that, people were just out having, enjoying the outdoors, and this attack happened, and people started protesting and demanding that both the government and the Taliban come together. Initially just dismissed because these were some people, grieving and making demands, but this group started then at the beginning of Ramadan marching 500 kilometers towards Kabul, fasting along the way, which they're not required to do if they're traveling. The number of people, it started out initially just a group of 8 or 11 people, grew at times to over 100. They were welcomed in areas that were in control by the Taliban, where stories of the Taliban saying don't go here or there. So it was really, and it got a lot of media coverage. Afghanistan actually has a very vibrant free press, and I think it showed to the Afghans that every Afghan can speak up and say their mind and say that they're fed up. So I think this dynamic of the changing legitimacy, the increasing pressure on the Taliban by international actors, and the grassroots movement to just push back and say, come to the negotiating table. The peace march came into Kabul then at this past Eid, and were welcomed, and that of course was at the 3-day truce that had taken place between the Taliban and government. And there were plenty of images on social media, Facebook, etc., of Taliban fighters coming into cities, celebrating Eid together, even with soldiers of the Afghan army. So the dynamic has changed quite a bit these last few months. Just to say that this next Eid, this Eid today, and this current offer of a truce and a ceasefire, which is actually a much longer ceasefire, potentially up to 3 months, is one where I think the pressure is now on the Taliban. They have not responded, but they don't have the same legitimacy. People are saying, you know, it's time, come and let's have some months of peace to negotiate. So the dynamic has changed. And what has been the impact? I think in a country where people have just, you know, it's hard to even pinpoint when there was peace last. There was a brief lull, you might say, in 2001, maybe up until 2003, 2004. But there was, of course, even during that time, periodic fighting in parts of the country. So I think people during this last ceasefire were able to imagine peace. 2/3 of Afghans are below the age of 25. These are young people who have grown up. Some of them have never really, you know, had a moment where they didn't have to worry about potential rockets or suicide bombers when they went to the market, etc. And just those 3 days, people were able to imagine what a normal life could be like. So I think that clearly changed the dynamic. And the religious support now of religious leaders throughout Afghanistan, but also you know, the larger Muslim world. After this past Eid celebration and the truce, there was a follow-up meeting of religious scholars, ulema, in Saudi Arabia, and they similarly strongly came out against suicide bombing, saying that this is not in line with Islamic teachings, and it was time for the Taliban to come to the negotiating table.
Right. Well, I think that's certainly a very powerful emotion for young Afghans to imagine and to feel what normal life must feel like. Let me now introduce or talk about the other factor into the equation, the long-term US military presence in Afghanistan, which has been cast in doubt with suggestions that President Trump will either initiate the pulling back of troops, or as more recently suggested, and somewhat ludicrously, consider privatizing the military operations in Afghanistan. Now, what is the impact of either of these actions on Afghanistan?
All right, well, let me just say that this bringing up of privatizing the war, this has been denounced. Both the Afghan government and to date the White House have both denied, actually, that there are any such plans to privatize.
That's great.
Mr. Prince, who was the founder of Blackwater, which is one of these agencies that would stand to tremendously benefit from any such privatization, is the one who's been advocating for it. So I think that already tells you, you know, who came up with this and what his interest is in this. On the larger question of pulling back the troops, you know, we're in 2018 now. This is the 17th year or 17th year that the U.S. troops have been in Afghanistan. This is the longest American war. And frankly, it's no longer a popular war, right? This is the problem that Americans are sort of wondering, what are our sons and daughters doing over there? And to some degree, you can understand it, that even the U.S. government, even under previous President Obama, felt this pressure from the population that it's no longer a popular war, what to do about it. But President Trump did put in a new strategy approximately a year ago, where he said that, you know, the troops and the U.S. commitment was going to be driven by realities on the ground, not an arbitrary deadline. This led to an increase in troops, and I think this has in fact put pressure on the Taliban. Now, you know, there have been terrible, really horrific incidences happening, from the attack on Ghazni, which is only 150 kilometers south of Kabul. Just a week ago, 5-day siege really of Ghazni, and many civilians killed there, women and children. To the recent bombing also of a Shia educational center in a Shia neighborhood where, by last count, over 40 students who were between the age of 15 and 19 died. And so clearly the Taliban is keeping the pressure up. They are continuing to engage, and the Afghan government is under pressure. But I also think that this is not the time to withdraw, right? This is not the time at such a crucial moment when the Afghan government is reaching out. There's quite a bit of engagement by other international actors from China, Russia, Indonesia to put pressure on the Taliban. This is not the time to be changing course. So I don't think they are realistic. Both the Afghan and US government have denied any such change in strategy being there. I think it was somebody with vested interest who put the idea out there, and I do hope that it's not going to get any more attention than that.
Right, certainly. Now, I think we've all agreed that there are enough people in Afghanistan and certainly outside of Afghanistan who want to see peace in their country. In your opinion, what's needed to bring peace back in the country? What's that missing piece in the puzzle? And how optimistic are you that this will happen?
Yeah, peace, right? I mean, the casualties, there's much to be pessimistic about when you look at Afghanistan today, right? When did Afghanistan last have peace? The situation looks grim. Casualties, I just looked at the number of casualties, annual list of casualties, and they're the highest they have been since 2001. Corruption is rampant. Transparency International ranks Afghanistan the third lowest, or it's the worst. I believe the ranking was 177 out of 180 countries,
right.
Pretty near the bottom. As I mentioned, Ghazni was under siege for 5 days. 50 students attacked and over 40 who were killed by suicide bombing. Yesterday, in fact, over 100, some reports are saying 170 people were kidnapped, pulled off of buses and kidnapped on their way home to celebrate Eid in Kunduz. And then today we heard the bombs raining down on Kabul, indeed from within Kabul. So there's much that, when you look at what's happening, much to be pessimistic about, and this question of, is it even possible, or are they stuck in this vicious cycle that there's no escape from? So what is needed? I think what is needed is, that one continues what countries have been doing, which is to, in the background, continue through bilateral means to put pressure on the Taliban. But this pressure cannot undermine the Afghan government. The Afghan government has to be in the driver's seat. They have to be the ones who would come to negotiating table. No other foreign actor should be doing the negotiating for the Afghan government. The Afghans have to be in the driver's seat. But I think it's important that China has leverage, Indonesia has leverage. There are new reports that the Russians are meeting September 3rd or 4th with the Taliban in Moscow. So countries are engaging and putting pressure and doing what they can. And I think it's important that they continue to do that. Pakistan is obviously one of the main power brokers there also, both in terms of arranging meetings between the Taliban and China, as well as arranging meetings also with the US. The US had a couple meetings with the Taliban in Qatar, the Taliban office in Qatar. So I think it's important that the pressure by other countries, international actors, does not let up. I also think that, you know, to continue putting religious pressure, this taking away of legitimacy from the Taliban by making it clear that this is no jihad that they're waging against their own people, against women and children and civilians out there. So I think we as international actors and individuals and organizations need to support these kind of gatherings of the Afghan ulema and within the country, but also religious scholars outside the country who clearly condemn and say this is not in line with the teachings of the Quran. In fact, no religion advocates killing of innocent individuals. I think it's also important to support the growing Afghan peace movement. Once this peace march came into Kabul, they met with different leaders, and they have been demonstrating in front of different embassies in Kabul, including the U.S., the Pakistani, the Russian embassy. They have been engaged and pushing to meet with the Taliban and take their message of peace. And that again undermines the Taliban, because these are ordinary Afghan citizens saying, we want peace, and I think that should be supported. One thing I also do want to come back to and mention is, 2/3 of Afghans are below the age of 25, and this plays out because these are young people who, instead of reading newspapers, are watching Facebook. They go on social media. And so to give them a sense of what normal life would look like, which they had a brief glimpse of in this last truce over the past Eid, these young people are fed up with war. They can see through social media what life looks like, what normal life looks like for their peers in other countries. And I think it's important that one creates avenues where they have jobs, possibilities for jobs, possibilities for living life in peace, and also enabling them to use social media to support the peace movement, to support social movements that clearly push back. And this is already putting also pressure on the Taliban. So we've had reports of the Taliban going out, entering cities and then interviewing with their cameras and phones, are you happy with our government here? And of course, what are those very scared individuals going to say? But it clearly shows that they know that there's a battle for legitimacy that they are starting to lose and that they have to engage in, which means I think it's all the more incumbent amongst, for all of us to get out there on social media and to support Afghan youth going out there through their peace march and demonstrations and really giving them the space to talk about their wishes, their hopes, and hopefully a combination of those factors will start to change things. I think in the long term, I am optimistic. I think, it's hard in some ways to be optimistic when much of the indicators are the worst, right? In terms of insecurity, casualties, opium crops are the highest they've ever produced, more than twice as high as under the Taliban regime. At the same time, I think we forget all the good stories of what has been achieved. Maternal mortality is much, much better than it was before. Obviously, there are kids in school when they weren't under the Taliban regime. So I think it's important for people to keep in mind what life was like under the Taliban regime and what has been achieved in these past 17 years. Certainly,
we are hopeful, and I think on this very auspicious week of Eid, as well as on the occasion of Afghanistan's Independence Day, we do wish the country and the Afghan people all the best and hope that they will see peace soon. Thank you, Dr. Rani. Thank you for sharing your time with us, and we look forward to engaging you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.